Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Divine Council mini-series. We are already 5 weeks into this course. Time is just flying. And thank you guys so much for the awesome questions and the feedback. Please keep them coming. And don't forget about the Faith in 20 podcast. Every Saturday at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, I release a new podcast. Quite often, I'll do a soft release on Friday evenings, though, if I have time to record earlier in the week. So please check that out. All of the content that we're learning here in the course, it's already been covered in the podcast and so much more than that. So please check that out as well. And just a reminder about this course is meant for folks who are already taking an interest in the Divine Council, who want to learn a bit more about it, want to become better teachers of it, and just really familiarize themselves with some of this more granular content. If you're not interested in the Divine Council worldview or you're in opposition to it, this stuff is not meant to persuade you. I teach this stuff because I enjoy it, because I have freedom and have been reconciled to Christ and I'm secure in that freedom. So if this isn't for you, then it's not for you. But if it is, then I'm glad you're here. Okay, so let's not waste any time. Lesson 1, we covered divine plurality. We looked at the created gods, multiple gods, does not violate Yahweh's sovereignty or authority in any way. Lesson 2, we talked about the Satan. We introduced evil into the world. Lesson 3, we talked about imaging God. What exactly does it mean for a human to be made in the likeness of God? Lesson 4, we hit Genesis 6, the second rebellion, verses 1 to 4. This was where the divine sons of God left their proper dwelling, cohabitated with human women, and produced these odd creatures, these Nephilim offspring. And we stopped right there. We didn't get into the Nephilim because, as we'll see today in Lesson 5, the Nephilim in and of themselves are a huge topic. There's a lot more to discuss when it comes to the Nephilim than what might appear on the surface. We also looked at some of the intertestamental period literature, or as commonly known, the Second Temple period literature, specifically First Enoch. And now, yes, Enoch is not inspired, but if it's uninspired, does that mean it's unimportant? Absolutely not. We looked at how the Book of Enoch and other intertestamental period literature actually informed the biblical writers and very much informed the New Testament writers. So if you have some kind of a grasp on the Second Temple period literature, or even just a little bit familiar with it, it will make you more intelligent when it comes to actually reading the scriptures, because you're going to understand what these biblical writers were alluding to. So, uninspired? Yeah. Unimportant? Absolutely not. Okay, on that note, let's get into our lesson today. We are looking at the spawn of rebellion, a look into the Nephilim. And yes, I'm not saying that this is exactly what the Nephilim look like. I just think it's a really cool picture. I'm not in any way going to suggest that they were blue or they were this large. As we'll see, it's probably quite the opposite. I just think it's a really cool picture, so I thought we'd go with it. All right, so to get our bearings here, I thought we'd actually go back and take another look at Genesis 6, 1 to 4, just so we can kind of get a grasp here of what we're going to discuss again today. And again, I'll be reading from the ESV unless I say otherwise. All right, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Okay, so on the heels of that, as I said, the last episode, we left off with stating what actually happened in Genesis 6, but we stopped just shy of exploring the Nephilim. So we have the divine beings coming to earth, assuming human flesh. They cohabited with women and produced these unusual like offspring. Now, we need to make the distinction that divine beings were not an incarnation. Were not like Jesus. They assumed human flesh. They were less than an incarnation, but they were not an incarnation. Assuming flesh and incarnating are not the same thing. And it's actually very important to make this distinction. I was discussing this with a friend the other day, and he brought up the excellent point that In the Mormon point of view, they are very familiar with the divine council, but what they actually believe is that Jesus was just another created Elohim in the divine council, and the divine council sent Jesus to be incarnate in the flesh, and he was somehow a sibling to evil or a sibling to Satan on the earth. Now, I don't proclaim to be an expert in this, but it's a very important view to discuss because we need to understand that Jesus was uncreated. Jesus was not created. He is the embodied Yahweh, the second power in heaven. What we're talking about with the multiple gods and the created Elohim, that's not Jesus. Jesus is God incarnate in the flesh on the earth. The divine beings that decided to transgress and rebel against God, they are not an incarnation. They simply just assumed human flesh. All right, moving forward, we need to do a little bit of debunking here before we get too far along. So, last time, if you recall, we talked a little bit about some of the post reformatory views when it comes to Genesis 6, particularly the Sethite view that was introduced by the early church father Martin Luther. And what that did is it stripped Genesis 6 of all its supernatural elements. And for someone who's going to take on this point of view, they would likely use Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 to 33 as a rebuttal for the divine being and human union. But I just want to make a point here that this is actually not a solid rebuttal because Matthew 22 doesn't teach that divine beings can't have sexual intercourse, only that they don't. And Genesis 6 doesn't have the spiritual world or the Edenic ideal in view. Actually, why don't we go ahead and take a look at Matthew 22 here, verses 23 to 33, just so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about here. Bear with me, working with Bible Gateway here. Okay, Sadducees ask about the resurrection. So that's the context here. The same day, Sadducees came to him, being Jesus, who said that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife shall she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry or nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. Okay, so again, this may come up as a rebuttal for the divine being and the human union, but as I said, it doesn't, Jesus never says anywhere that they were incapable of having sexual intercourse, and certainly does not allude to the fact that divine beings could not sin. They certainly could transgress, and they did, and they ended up having sexual intercourse. They weren't supposed to, but they did. Nowhere in scripture does it say that they were actually incapable of it. And again, when we go back to Genesis 6, it doesn't have the spiritual world or the Edenic ideal in mind. Of course, after the bodily resurrection, there is no need to be fruitful and multiply on the earth anymore. We will be like the angels. There was never a need for divine beings to reproduce, but it never said that they physically could not do it. So that's the distinction we have to make there. And just another point I want to bring up, I do find it interesting, folks who take on the Sethite view or try to strip the scriptures or Genesis 6 of everything supernatural, because the idea of divine beings leaving their proper realm, cohabitating with human women and producing their own offspring is no more unusual than Yahweh himself incarnating as a human, coming into this world through a birth canal and experiencing how to walk, talk, eat, poop all over again. But as Christians, we have to accept that incarnation because it defines what Christianity is. So we strip Genesis 6, or some of us strip Genesis 6 of the supernatural element. But if you think about what actually defines Christianity, it's no more unusual. it's it's not that crazy if you think about it. So, anyways, just a little debunking on that end. And then also the giant thing. So we will get into the giants, but of course, they are commonly thought of as giants, the Nephilim, but there's no evidence that they were unusually tall. They were more likely in the 6 to 8 foot range. For example, in Deuteronomy 3:11, we see a description of Og's bed, which was about 9 cubits, and 1 cubit equals about 18 inches. So probably the average Israelite was around 5'5" to 5'7". So compared to them, yeah, they probably seem pretty tall, but to us today, they probably weren't that much taller than anyone in the NBA, to be quite honest. And the Nephilim were dubbed the mighty men of renown, or warriors. So when you think about who the Nephilim were, they were the men who became warriors. They were the men who rose up. They were the ones who were the obstacle in the way of the Israelites coming into the promised land, as we're going to see when we move down the line here. All right, moving forward, this quote unquote giant language, we need to decipher this a little bit here. Okay, so the Second Temple period Jews viewed the Nephilims as giants. So I want you to keep that in mind as we analyze the word Nephilim, that they did view them as giants. So also did the Mesopotamian background. So the Mesopotamian background and the Second Temple Jewish background both viewed the Nephilim as being giants. Now, the word Nephilim only occurs 2 times in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The first one we've already seen in Genesis 6:4, and the second being in Numbers 13:33. And you'll recall this is where Moses sends the spies over to check on the promised land in Canaan, and they come back scared, seeing all of these warriors, all of these men of renown, saying, "We seem like grasshoppers to them." That's that one, which we will read in a bit. So in the Septuagint, in the 2 times we see this, it's translated as gigas, Gigas, or giant. Also, the Greek manuscripts of First Enoch use this word gigas. So it seems obvious that it should be read as giants, but some scholars actually resist this, suggesting that the name is based on the idea that it's derived from the Hebrew word NPL, nephal, meaning to fall. So it could be fallen ones or those who fall. And there were no vowels in the original Hebrew. So it was just N, P, and L. The A's were added later. So the second interpretation, though, of the fallen one, it's keep in mind that it occurred to avoid acknowledging the semi-divine nature of the Nephilim. This, of course, was a further attempt to argue in favor of the sons of God being human rather than divine. The second interpretation is also based on the characterization of their behavior rather than speaking to the identity of the Nephilim. So, if we take that description or that interpretation of them being those who fall or the fallen ones, it still doesn't speak to the actual identity of what they were. It just characterizes their behavior, which, sure, we can call them the fallen ones. It still doesn't solve for the identity of the Nephilim. So, in the Mesopotamian background and the Second Temple context that I've already mentioned, the fathers are described as divine and offsprings as the giants. So, calling them fallen ones is actually unimportant in the translation. As I said, it just doesn't have any bearing on their identity. So, where does that leave us? Well, the conclusion to this is Nephilim is spelled 2 different ways in the Hebrew Bible. We have Nephilim with the I there, and then we have Nephilim with the Y, Nephiylim. The difference here is the Y, of course, and as I said, the original Hebrew had no vowels. So the Hebrew scribes started using consonants to mark long vowel sounds. We do this in English as well. So I know the Hebrew language can seem a bit intimidating, and I'm certainly no expert by any means, but when you start to understand the grammar rules with Hebrew, you'll see it actually coincides quite a bit with the English language. So the point being is the root behind the second term has a long I or a Y sound in it before the plural ending IM was added. So this means we know the word does not actually mean those who fall, because if it was, it would be spelled Nophilim, Nophelim. All right. So let's look at what a more reasonable explanation would be for this. So, why did the translators constantly think of giants? What position best solves for the translation for Nephilim with the Y, as we see in Numbers 13:33? I keep mentioning Numbers 13:33, so why don't we just go ahead and read it so you guys know exactly what I'm talking about here? All right. Again, this is where Aaron sent the spies to go look into the promised land and to see what they're up against. And they saw the Nephilim, which they were apparently afraid of. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Probably a bit of an exaggeration there, but I'm sure they were pretty terrified. Okay, so what solves for the translation for this Nephilim with the Y and satisfies the Mesopotamian and the Second Temple period Jews in terms of the giants? Well, if you'll recall from the Old Testament, the Jewish intellects were taken to Babylon, they went into exile, and during that 70-year period, they learned to speak Aramaic. And then they brought it back to Judah, and Aramaic became the primary language. So, in order to capture this sort of grandiose nature of these creatures, the scribes adopted the Aramaic noun Naphilia, meaning giant, Naphiyyla. And when this word is actually imported and pluralized for the Hebrew language, it becomes Nephilim, which is exactly what we see in Numbers 13:33. So, this is not a hill I'm going to die on. I'm not married to this explanation, but it is a very reasonable explanation, and it does solve for why we see this language in Numbers 13:33. And it also explains why everyone thinks of it as giant, because it doesn't. What the scribes were doing was they weren't necessarily saying, these guys were definitely as tall as skyscrapers. We're not meant to take that literally. What they were trying to do is capture the grandiose nature of these men of renown, the grandiose nature of these warriors. And this is the word they used to do just that. So, as we move forward, let's get a bit of a description about who these guys actually were. As you see in the title there, they were absolutely devoted to destruction, and that's ultimately why they needed to be destroyed. So, just to look at some of the intertestamental period literature here, because I think it certainly it beefs up the description about the Nephilim. Really, what we see from Numbers 33 is obviously, they were big. Genesis 6 tells us they were warriors, they were men of renown. But if we go into the Second Temple period literature, it kind of expands a bit on these descriptions, and we get a better idea of what these guys were doing that was actually so bad. So I'm going to take from Jubilees, chapter 7, verse 22, and it says, "And they beget sons, the Nephilim." So we're talking about the watchers or the divine beings that transgressed, and they beget sons, the Nephilim, and they were all dissimilar and they devoured one another. So what that tells me is you couldn't really tell one for the other because these unions were never meant to happen in the first place. The offspring came out looking any which way, and they were obviously born with some cannibalistic tendencies because they immediately started to devour one another. Jubilees chapter 7, verses 23 and 24 says that they devoted themselves to injustice, bloodshed. The earth was full of sin. After devouring one another, they sinned against birds and beasts and animals on the earth. So, again, if you'll recall from previous lessons, I mentioned that the Genesis 3 event is what started sin in the world, but the Genesis 6 event, in the eyes of a Second Temple period Jew, is what caused sin to proliferate in the world. And based on the description of what we see in Jubilees here, obviously it was causing sin to proliferate in the world. They were cannibalistic, they were devouring everything in their path. And this gives us an idea of what led to God's decision to cause the flood. It says in Jubilees goes further to say everything man worked for was destroyed by the Nephilim. So the men could not sustain themselves. They didn't stand a chance. So of course God had to take action. And just a fragment here from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I want to make sure we're being as correct as possible in this. And I know some folks don't like to listen to the intertestamental period literature. So let's take a fragment from the actual Dead Sea Scrolls. This is 4Q531, fragment 2, which says, "And they were seeking to devour," in speaking about the Nephilim and the giant clans here, the monsters attacked it. So the Dead Sea Scrolls referred to them as monsters. So this gives a sense of why the only option was to destroy this breed, and gives us a bit more clarity on why God states in Genesis 6:3, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever. For they are mortal, their days will be 120 years." God obviously saw that this proliferation of sin could not continue, and this had to be capped off at some point. Remember, the celestial and the terrestrial were never meant to cohabitate in this way. Prior to sin entering the world, we were all supposed to be one family in the divine council, but because the celestial beings transgressed the way they did, we couldn't be. The heavens had to become closed to us. God had to do something about this constant proliferation of sin, this constant bloodshed, this entire species of dissimilar creatures that were absolutely devoted to injustice and bloodshed. And as we've looked at in previous lessons, the divine beings could not redeem themselves. But if you look at Genesis 6:3, for those of you that have a study Bible, you'll notice that it coincides with Isaiah 57:16, which gives us a hint that God had always intended to save the human beings, the terrestrial beings. We were special in his eyes. Isaiah 57:16 says, "For I will not contend forever, nor will I always be angry. For the spirit would grow faint before me, and the breath of life that I made." So it gives us a little bit of hint and foreshadowing that God was always going to save his terrestrial beings. We were always special in his eyes, and he did not want us to be completely destroyed. So the divine beings, they couldn't be redeemed no matter what they did. And of course, as we looked at in the last episode, this is why they were held in chains in the abyss, and they will stay there until the day of the Lord, which is outlined in Revelation chapter 9. All right, so moving forward, in those days and afterward, we've heard this before. Genesis 6:4, we read this earlier. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward. And I don't know about you, but during the time I went to church and some of the Bible studies I've been a part of, we read that verse and then we leave it there because we don't know what to do with it. Because the assumption is that if the flood was global, if it really did cleanse the entire earth, then how could it possibly be that the Nephilim were there afterward? Well, don't be too shocked here, but what I'm going to do is give some evidence for a regional flood, meaning that the flood didn't cleanse the entire earth as we think of it, but cleansed the known world at the time of the biblical writers and readers. So we can absolutely argue this with scripture. And again, this is not the hill I'm going to die on. I'm not married to this. I'm just saying that we can use scripture to absolutely debate this point, and it works. It works for the known world at the time. So the common assumption is that Genesis 1, 1 to 3 is the context for the flood. It's the world at the time. But Genesis 9 actually defines whole earth as peoples and lands that extend from Noah, which is listed in Genesis 10, or the table of nations. So the biblical writers define whole earth differently than what we do. And if we say that Genesis 10 is the correct context for interpreting Genesis 6 to 8, these were the nations known to the biblical writers. So, quote, all the earth and all the flesh used in context of the known world at that time, the whole earth as a global entity is only an assumption. Whole earth does not actually mean entire earth. Whole earth means the entire known world at that time, being Genesis 10, or the table of nations, which talks about Noah and his three sons and all of the clans and the genealogy that went out from there. That was the known world at the time. It obviously is not including Australia, China, North or South America, or anywhere like that, but in the mind of a biblical writer, this is the whole world. So, and if we talk about a regional flood, it's not as if that takes away from the grandiose nature of the flood. It still encompassed hundreds of thousands of square miles, and it does not violate scripture. It can absolutely be argued using scripture, and we'll see that as we move forward. So the global language actually becomes a bit nonsensical if you consider Genesis 10 to be the context of the world in Genesis 1 through 11. And I will let you guys know that tomorrow or sorry, Friday, I'm going to probably do a soft release on my next podcast episode. I'm going to be discussing a regional flood using only scripture and showing you how we can absolutely debate a regional flood from scripture. And it's going to expand greatly on what we're talking about today. So please subscribe to the channel, check your notifications there, and I'll have a new podcast episode this weekend all about a regional flood, which you can absolutely argue using just scripture. All right. So, and speaking of just using scripture, let's go into the biblical justification for this. Okay. So, the Hebrew word kol, K O L, for all, and eretz, ERETS, for the earth, show up in other passages that cannot mean global. And I apologize to any Hebrew scholars or anyone who speaks Hebrew if I say those incorrectly. So what we're saying as is when we see the words all flesh or all earth used in different passages, there are a lot of places where it's being used in passages that cannot absolutely mean global, and we're totally comfortable with that. Let's look at a few examples here. Let's start with Genesis 2:11. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah where there is gold. Okay, so this is describing the Garden of Eden here. Not every place in Havilah was infiltrated by this river. That would be impossible, nor did it surround the entire land. But again, we're seeing this language of all here, or all earth. What it's describing is everything known at that time. It's not encompassing the entire world. What about Genesis 41:56? Which reads, "So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt." So obviously, the entire globe was not affected by the famine. Egypt was not responsible for feeding the entire globe. We're only talking about a certain land or certain peoples, but the way the biblical writer describes it, it makes it seem like it's the entire globe, but we know realistically it's not. So why would these rules apply here but not apply to the flood? And I'm going to leave you with some more examples, but we'll just take a look at one more here. Genesis 13:9. That is, and this is Abraham's discourse to Lot. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. So obviously, Lot did not have the entire globe before him. Abraham was only speaking about a certain portion of the land. They were not talking about going off to China or Australia or anywhere else. And we accept that. We know what he's talking about. We're comfortable with that. Again, why would these same rules not apply to the flood? And if you want to go a bit further with that, a few other examples I found is Genesis 2:13, 1 Samuel 14:25, and Isaiah 14:7, where you're going to see that all language again, where if you look at it at face value, it looks as though we're speaking about the entire globe, but we know as the biblical readers that they can't absolutely be speaking about this. So why would the same rules again not apply to the flood? And again, I will be releasing that podcast. So if you're confused at all by this or you need more information, just hold tight for another day here and you'll be able to listen to the podcast, which will explain this in far more detail. All right. So post flood sightings of the Nephilim, Numbers 13:33. We already looked at that. So if Genesis 10 becomes the context for the flood, then this aligns with why the Israelites were confronted with the Nephilim prior to entering in the promised land. This fits perfectly. It answers our question. It doesn't take anything away from scripture. It does not violate what's being read in scripture here. So this absolutely does fit if you do want to take on this idea of a regional flood. So it makes sense then, the people who lived in Canaan, from whence these giant clans came, where did they live? They occupied the places that were actually described in Genesis 10. So again, we have another distinction there. They were occupying the places that were described in the Table of Nations. So this makes perfect sense. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Hurrians from Anatolia, and all of the other clans, they all came out of the Table of Nations here. So, if we take on the idea of the regional flood, then we can understand that not every living being was killed in the flood globally. So, it is entirely possible that these beings had ancestors that survived the flood. There is no evidence in the text that further divine beings descended and committed these acts as they did in Genesis 6, because this is kind of a rebuttal that I've heard to this. Well, the flood is absolutely global. Maybe we just had other sons of God coming down and transgressing in the exact same way that they did in Genesis 6. But if you think about it, what would have been the point of God cleansing the earth, or at least having a regional flood here, knowing that these beings were going to come and do this again? We would just have this constant cycle over and over again. And we already know that these 200 watchers are bound in Tartarus. So the punishment is going to be really heavy for this. I don't see how Yahweh would put us in a position where we're going to constantly have these cycles over and over again. So there's no evidence whatsoever in scripture that the watchers or the sons of God descended and committed these acts. I've also heard rumblings that perhaps Noah himself was a child of a watcher, and this is how the DNA spread. But that doesn't make sense either. This is a viewpoint of some of the early rabbinics here. In my opinion, it's sort of a fairy tale, but that wouldn't make sense in Yahweh's position either, because Yahweh chose Noah and his family to start this new creation mandate over with. And knowing that Yahweh's spirit was not going to contend with human beings, why on earth would he possibly choose someone who would have Nephilim DNA or Watcher DNA in him to start over again? That is completely opposes the character of Yahweh, and we see no evidence whatsoever in scripture. So personally, I feel that the regional flood makes a lot more sense than any of those ideas. So, as we know, Israel's survival as the people of Yahweh was connected with the defeat of the Nephilim. This was the primary obstacle for conquering the promised land, as we see in the book of Numbers. And then the final DNA of the Nephilim lineage was, of course, David's slaying of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 50 to 51. All right. That's going to wrap it up for today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed that lesson. So, as I said, there's a lot more to talk about of the Nephilim than we first thought. So, please listen to the podcast. I have so much Divine Council material in the podcast. Introduction to the Divine Council, introduction to Divine Rebellion. I've talked about the bodily resurrection, the two powers in heaven, all of this stuff. So if you're craving more of this Divine Council worldview material, please go and check it out. Like, give me some feedback, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll